Welcome to Poetry Changes Lives. What if I told you that one of the greatest psychotherapists who ever lived never had a consulting room, never had a qualification, and moreover died over 400 years ago? Welcome again to Poetry Changes Lives, where today we're stepping into something I like to call Shakespeare, the Shrink, or perhaps more gently, in therapy with William Shakespeare. Let me begin with one of his lines. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It's so important I'll read it again. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. That may sound rather like something you might hear in a therapist consulting room, doesn't it? And yet it comes from his great play, Hamlet. Shakespeare doesn't just tell great stories, he tells them with insight and compassion. And so we recognise ourselves in them so often. Ben Jonson, his friend and fellow playwright and actor, said, "He is not of an age, but for all time." And I would add, he understood the human mind as deeply as anyone who has ever lived. That's quite something to say about anyone. I say it because Shakespeare knew something that we, hundreds of years later, still struggle to accept, that we often create our own suffering through our faults, our feelings, and our actions, which are all interconnected. If I asked that old Monty Python flying circus question, what has Shakespeare ever done for us? I'd get a long list, but therapy might not necessarily be on it, yet it most certainly should be, because when Hamlet says, "Thinking makes it so," he is anticipating the central truth of modern therapy. It is not what happens to us, it's how we interpret it and respond that matters. We are not victims of circumstance, we are our own masters. And Shakespeare adds another layer. In the same play he has Polonius, the king's adviser, say, "Give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought his act." In other words, he recognized the connection between thoughts, feelings, and actions. Not every thought needs to be spoken, and certainly not every thought needs to be acted on either. Take Macbeth, a man destroyed by ambition, or Falstaff, the embodiment of success, yet eventually rejected like an addiction can be rejected. When the king says of his own old boon companion of his youth, "I know thee not, old man," and goes on in similar vein, it's a goodbye letter if there ever was one. And then there's blaming. In Julius Caesar, when he says, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves," he's echoing that fact that how often do we try to avoid responsibility by trying to blame others or circumstances or just anything but ourselves. Shakespeare saw that so clearly. But perhaps where Shakespeare is most therapeutic is in his understanding of pain, beautifully described that in a way that any therapist would recognise in his play Henry IV Part 1, when he has Lady Percy describing her husband Harry Hotspur's suffering. It's sort of so evocative of trauma. Why dost thou bend thine eyes upon the earth and start so often when thou sitst alone? In thy faint slumbers I by thee have watched and heard thee murmur tales of iron wars. This is centuries before we had even dreamt of the word term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and yet Shakespeare captures the symptoms so perfectly. And in his play King John, he has Constance speak of the terrible trauma of losing her child. Grief fills the room up of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words. Anyone who's lost someone will recognise that. Grief becomes a real presence of its own. Or take that feeling of despair that Shakespeare portrays in King Lear, when Lear cries out, "Oh, let me not be mad, not mad, sweet heaven, keep me in temper, I would not be mad." This is a man, we hear, who has lost everything, his power, his identity, even his mind. And when we hear these words, something extraordinary happens. We feel understood somehow. We feel less alone. And in itself, it is deeply therapeutic, because Shakespeare doesn't just show us suffering. He shows us also self-reflection and responsibility, taking responsibility for some kind of recovery and the possibility of change. He shows us what happens when we go wrong, and also what it might take to put things right. So perhaps Shakespeare, the Shrink, is not such a strange idea after all. He may never have sat in a consulting room, but 400 years later he's still helping us. He's reading some of these magnificent passages in Shakespeare's works, helps us understand ourselves, face ourselves, and just possibly change ourselves. And if that's true, then perhaps the greatest therapist of all time was that playwright, the man who said, "Nothing, either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for listening today.